Hello and good morning.
ACNC?
Yeah, how are you doing?
I'm good for a Thursday morning. Me and Miles are just sitting here and, goofing around.
Arrow, Michael just said you're an asshole, and he was like, look, just if you need to drop the mic and leave this interview, you can, because people hate this guy. So that's fine. I get it.
It's because I'm not a whistleblower. So, he says, come on, dude, come forward.
See, told you. All yours until 19.
We're going to have fun.
Does the average person know what a whistleblower is? Because, you saw yesterday's headlines. Two of them have come forward now, even with Hunter Biden. And it's like, I still sit there and I read those articles going, what's going on here?
Yeah, look, the whistleblower is a term that has sometimes been a dirty term, and it's sometimes been, one of the premium labels to have. And it really just depends on your political perspective. I think during the era of Edward Snowden exposing national security secrets, it really did become a dirty term because he was, selling out the safety of Americans. But what we tried to do with this series, The Whistleblowers, is go talk to people who exposed corruption and figure out what happened to them, what happened in their lives, what did the personal story look like, put aside the politics. And it was really fascinating. And frankly, one piece of it, Arrow, was inspiring, frankly, which is that each of these people, even though they had homes destroyed and lives destroyed and had to move around and fear for their lives, at the end of the day, they didn't regret speaking up, whether they were a Democrat or a Republican, and regardless of their allegation, they still felt like the right thing was speaking up. And we just don't hear enough stories like that today.
Absolutely. Listeners need to know right away that the name of the podcast on iHeartRadio is The Whistleblowers Inside the Trump Administration. I think one of my attractions to it is that you really don't go into it like, oh, I'm political, because people are tired of that. But you are sharing an authentic freaking story here.
Yeah, I'm really tired of it. Arrow, I'm very happy to be on with you. But if it weren't me being on with you, I hate talking about politics.
Yes.
I went into government not to be involved in electoral politics, which is just gross. I went into government to be a part of national security. After 9/11, I wanted to go stop another terrorist attack from happening again. It's why I joined the Bush administration. It's why I've been working in national security. But frankly, I had to start talking about politics because after witnessing Donald Trump firsthand kind of mishandling the job and trying to use presidential powers for his own benefit, I felt like, well, look, the only way to stop this from happening again is I've got to talk about it in the political sphere. And I say that as a lifelong Republican, but the guy we can't make the mistake again. And, that's one of the things I'm trying to sound the alarm about.
Boy, we are so much on the same page because I do a podcast called The Daily Mess, and you can't be afraid to talk about everyday things. If we're not talking about it, then how do other people take it to the water cooler?
Yeah, for sure. And that's actually, and I'm sure, Arrow, you talk about this in your podcast. It's sort of affecting everyone right now. Yes. It doesn't matter if you're Democrat or Republican. Everyone's afraid of getting canceled. They're afraid of getting canceled on Instagram and on Twitter and people saying mean things on Facebook. And guess what? The data shows it. There are polls that show that your average American today is far more likely than they've ever been to misrepresent their true opinions in public and then share their real views in private. But guess who's not afraid to share their real views in public? The surveys show the far extremes. On the far right and the far left, those people say what they're thinking. That self-censorship, I think, is the biggest threat to democracy. The fact that the majority of us in the middle have been intimidated by the extremes and cowed into silence is really what's put us at risk.
Dude, we're being bombarded with so many new things and new ideas, and most of us have no freaking clue. We can barely run our smartphones. How do we know what woke is versus critical race theory? We don't know.
Yeah. And by the way, these culture war clashes are really pulling us apart all the way down to the family level. Like who listening right now can honestly say they haven't experienced it? Be real. There's someone in your family that's the black sheep and alienated, either because, they're a woke lefty or they're a MAGA far right person. That's not how it should be. When I first came into government after 9/11, there was a sense of unity in our politics, right? We saw Democrats and Republicans join arms on the Capitol steps and sing God Bless America. Boy, does it feel like we're really, really far from that right now. Now people are running for public office to become famous. They think it's a quick way to get attention and instead of governing. And in fact, I hear about these members of Congress who I used to work with who don't even have experts on their staff anymore. They just hire comms people. Why? Because they want one person running their TikTok, one person running their Instagram, because it's about fame. That is not what government's supposed to be about. And I was joking with someone today, Arrow, that there's that old saying that Washington, D.C. is Hollywood for ugly people. And for some reason, these politicians, these aspiring politicians think that's actually a compliment. And they're like, oh, I get it. This is a fast way for me to become famous, even though I'm not pretty. That's pretty scary stuff.
Look at all the news agencies that are doing the same exact thing. I mean, seriously, I have to go to 5 or 6 different places to get my news and then make my own choice of what I want to believe. That's not Walter Cronkite.
That's not Walter Cronkite, and we're a long ways away from where we had those paragons of integrity delivering us unfiltered, unvarnished news without a political bent. And, I really want to see us go back to that period. And again, I say all these things as a conservative, but on that note, I mean, one of the things I was very frustrated by in the Trump years is that Donald Trump, who I was working for, so viciously attacked the overall concept of freedom of speech and freedom of the press because he didn't want bad things written about him. I think we can claw our way back from it, but the operative word is claw our way back because we've gotten so far deep into this hole. It's going to take a while to repair that damage. And the last thing we should do is put someone like that back in office. And that's why I say to my fellow Republicans, time for us to move on. Let's go pick someone who's a real conservative next time.
My father fought in World War II, and he always used to tell me, do not ever fly by the seat of your pants. And I swear to God, that's where we are right now. And we've got to put some prep into what we do and think about what we're about ready to say.
Well, and we have to do honor to that generation.
Yes.
I mean, at the risk of sounding, too emotive about it. I mean, people like, your family members, mine, who fought and in some cases died to protect this country would be rolling over in their graves if they saw what, we're doing to ourselves right now. And one of the things that, people told me for this book Blowback that I just wrote is about plans in a second Trump administration to dismantle the Department of Veterans Affairs and kick veterans out on the street. In fact, the quote from one of Trump's own heads of the Veterans Affairs Department was he thought the vets were lazy malingerers and he wanted to use the money somewhere else. That's not a conservative. That's not the Republican Party I grew up in. We respected our veterans. And that's the type of thing that shows us it's a blinking red light that says something's wrong if we've got public officials who think it's okay to go attack the people who've served our country in uniform.
I got to ask you, I'm blessed with the opportunity to talk to a lot of U.S. soldiers, men and women, who write books, and they've got to get their stuff, okayed by the government before it's printed. How are you getting this podcast beyond the government censors?
It's a great question, especially in the age of censorship, right? Well, the Whistleblowers podcast, thankfully, and I'm sure your listeners will feel the same way. Thankfully, it's mostly not about Miles Taylor.
Right.
You don't have to hear too much of me. It's really about these other folks. And, we spend a lot of time going in deep with other whistleblowers from inside the government, people like Alex Vindman from the National Security Council, or the acting director of the FBI, Andy McCabe, or Olivia Troy, who was Homeland Security advisor to Vice President Pence, but also people out in the field, a nurse who was one of the earliest people to spot problems with COVID spreading through detention facilities and what happened next. And their stories are, I think, where we need to shine the spotlight, because they provided, to me, inspiration about how in this environment of political intimidation, you can still speak out and you can still do the right thing without having your life completely destroyed. And we talked to each of these people who experienced a lot of hardship. I mean, it's a pretty gripping, harrowing, and gut-wrenching podcast. But every single one of them we asked at the end, despite the consequences, do you regret blowing the whistle?
Yeah.
And not a single one said they regretted it. And man, in an age where, again, people are just constantly attacked for trying to do the right thing, that was great to hear.
Yeah. One of the things that, and this is how effective your podcast is, the whistleblowers inside the Trump administration, this is how effective it is that it inspires me to have a voice. Because I twice last week, the upper level of management said, stop it. People don't need to hear what's going on here. And I'm going, oh, yes, they do. Oh, yes, they do. And and that's what I love about this podcast is that you're giving me the opportunity to believe that I have a voice.
Well, and folks we're Arrow, you and I are at grave risk right now of sounding like elementary school teachers trying to buck up the class. But we mean it. I mean, as people have gotten way too far away from being sincere and just being themselves. And we see it all the time. And, I wouldn't be the first one to rag on social media, but everyone feels like they have to do a performance right now and portray themselves as something they are not. And it is effing exhausting to do that, right? Yeah. I mean, who listening right now doesn't feel like that's really exhausting? And those of us who quit certain social media platforms do it because we're just too tired. We're tired of having to try to pretend. And it's really, really refreshing to have a conversation where you can just be yourself. And also this applies to our politics. And it's one of the reasons why I was really just grateful that they approached me to do this iHeart podcast is because there's some catharsis in being able to talk to someone of a different political opinion and find common ground. That would have sounded really silly for me to say 20 years ago, but now it's like a novelty to have a conversation. If you're a woke person on the left, to sit down with a MAGA person or vice versa. It doesn't happen anymore. But when it does and you humanize that person, really, really changes your perspective. And we need to do a lot more of that.
Oh, it so reminds me of the way that the world of religion is, too. It's like Southern Baptist versus Catholic versus Jewish. I mean, everybody has their own story and they're sticking to it.
Yeah. And my exhortation to people would be invite it into your lives because you're not actually going to accidentally run into that person of another firm opinion that's opposite yours anymore because we've all self-selected into these tribes. And again, the data shows it. In fact, the data shows that by zip code in this country, red zip codes are getting redder and blue zip codes are getting bluer. We're just self-selecting into these tribes. So you're not just going to bump into those people anymore. You've got to seek it out. And when you seek it out, it's going to surprise you and be rewarding. I do Twitter spaces sometimes, and I beg people of different political persuasions to come join me because then we have real conversations. I mean, there's a guy, I won't name him. There's a guy who just hated me because I came out against Trump, and he's a fellow conservative. We're both conservatives. He's a hardcore MAGA conservative. I'm more of a moderate. And boy, did he say nasty things on social media. And we wound up on a Twitter spaces together. And you know what? We had the best time. We had an absolute riot. Do we still disagree with each other? We do. But conversations like that need to happen more.
So let me ask you a question because, I mean, I get in more trouble because of the things that I write. How were you able to create a conversation with somebody without hearing his inflection, his emotions? I mean, how did you read into his thoughts?
Yeah, well, I think long form does it, that's not meant to be self-serving for you and me, Arrow, while we're having a long form conversation. But we too quickly moved into this era of like popcorn talking points, where it's like a quick tweet on social media, and you go on MSNBC and you got 3 bullet points, and then you're off, and it makes it really easy to dehumanize people because you don't have enough time with them to see them as a human being. And it also forces them to say things to get attention that they normally wouldn't say. So it just makes people sound more extreme. This format and the resurgence of radio and podcasting, I think, allows us to spend time with people and to humanize them again. And I'll give you a quick example. I used to not be a fan of Pete Buttigieg. I'm not a Democrat. Yeah. And Pete grew up not far from me in Indiana. And I was like, you know what? That guy's just been trying to be president of the United States since the day he was born. And I can just see it on that smirk on his face, blah, blah, blah. I had all these opinions of him. And then I listened to him on the daily podcast, I think, for an hour. And I left that podcast and I turned to my now wife, Hannah, and I was like, oh, man, I really like that guy. I'd love to have a beer with him. but only long form can do that. So, we have to actually spend a little more time with each other. Again, we're at the risk of sounding like elementary school teachers, but those kindergarten lessons are the real life lessons that we're coming back now in this age of social media vitriol and realizing are the important things we need to remember.
You talk about the podcast, and it's like you're sitting here looking at my notes, because one of the things that I wanted to talk to you about is that podcasting is not controlled by the government, not yet. Therefore, this is our voice, and I look forward to the 2024 elections because people are going to start spreading their voice and their concerns as well as the other side of it through podcasts.
Well, Arrow, you forget that I come from the national security community. So I am sitting here right now reviewing your notes. It's Good. The camera up above you in the smoke alarm that you can't see. I think there is a real fear and a legitimate fear about government censorship. And, you get attacked in this day and age if you're what's called a both sideser, if you criticize both sides. But I'm going to criticize both sides. I'm going to criticize my side, the conservative side, and say, people in our party like Donald Trump have been saying some pretty spooky things about using government power to censor the political opposition. But also on the far left, we've had folks who talk about wanting to take over the regulatory institutions of government to silence certain types of outlets and the dissemination of certain types of information. That's the kind of stuff that scares people. That's the kind of stuff that gets people to want to go around the system. And we've got to nip that in the bud. And what worries me as a national security person is I see in the data that Americans' attitudes towards political violence are more favorable than they've ever been. In other words, more Americans today, 25% of Americans have a positive view of violence towards the government, which is the highest watermark we've ever seen it. Why do they feel that way? Because they think the system's not responding to them. So we've got to lower the temperature before some sort of spark turns that powder keg into an explosion.
I've got a question for you, the Department of Homeland Security. This goes all the way back to 2001 for the Patriots Act. We had to take our IDs and to this place so we could all be with the Patriots Act. Why did I have to bring a birth certificate to prove that I have no middle name? Because I'll never forget looking at the woman going, I don't understand. She says, this is the Patriots Act. I've held on to this for this long, and to this day I still don't understand why I had to prove that I had no middle name.
Well, Arrow, I think you've got a great example of why government can be really sluggish and really stupid. And sometimes those experiences can go from sluggish and stupid to actually just offensive because you're just offending who you are. And look, I try to be an optimist. I'm a big fan of the Killers, and I self-style as Mr. Brightside. And my optimistic view on this is I do think some leaps that we're seeing in technology will allow us to make government faster, more efficient, and hopefully less invasive in our lives. In fact, I can't really think of many people I know who say, man, I want more government in my life. We don't really want more government. And hopefully these tech developments can make government less bloated, more efficient, and less divisive. So I'm not just going to cross my fingers on that. I spend a lot of time trying to promote policies like that in Washington. So hopefully we get there.
Oh, I'm so proud of you for doing this. The whistleblowers inside the Trump administration, because I know this is just the first step of a brand new beginning. You're going to grow into other areas, and we're going to talk about other whistleblowers in other businesses. I just think this is where the conversation begins.
Well, Arrow, I appreciate you. You're a patriot, and I love the Carolinas, so I'll see you next time I'm down there.
Absolutely. You be brilliant today, okay, sir?
All right. Thanks, my friend.